Right, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. It is a real privilege to welcome you all to this critically important session of the Policy Forum about the potential integration of the World Bank and the IFC and MIGA's accountability mechanisms. My name is David Pred. I'm the Executive Director of Inclusive Development International. We are an organization that works to support communities around the world to prevent harm and to secure redress for the harmful impacts of investment projects. And the topic of this discussion that we're going to have today is mission critical for my organization, and I think for many of the CSOs who are in the room today who rely on the World Bank's accountability mechanisms to help communities access justice for harms that they've suffered as a result of World Bank-funded projects. Usually when there are no other recourse available. Now, I think a hallmark of President Bonga's tenure has been the integration of teams in this institution to improve efficiency and effectiveness under a one World Bank group approach. Recent changes that we have seen include the merging of the environmental and social functions of the World Bank and IFC MIGA, and the restructuring of IBRD, IDA, and IFC teams into a unified knowledge system. And also as part of this integration, the World Bank's Board of Directors is also considering the consolidation of the independent accountability mechanisms of the public and private sector arms of the bank. That's the World Bank Accountability Mechanism, consisting of the World Bank Inspection Panel and the Dispute Resolution Service on the one hand, and IFC MIGA's Compliance Advisor Ombudsman on the other. Now, so far, I think there has been pretty limited information about this potential consolidation process in the public domain. And what we're hoping to do today is shine a little bit of light on what's going on. Civil society is seeking greater clarity and information from the board and from the mechanism leaders who we have here with us today about the timing and about the goals of these changes. Most of all, we want to ensure that integration, if it happens, results in a better accountability system for the affected people who need to use it. So with that background and context, I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel and tell you how we are going to run this session. So our first speaker, who we're so grateful for joining us today, is Rameshwar Iyer, the Executive Director of the World Bank Group representing Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Sri Lanka. In that capacity, Mr. Iyer is also the chair of the Committee on Development Effectiveness. Our other speakers and panelists include Margot Day, who's the Executive Director of Accountability Council, Aaron Pedrosa, who's the Senior Attorney at the Philippine Movement for Climate Justice, Janine Ferretti, who heads the Office of the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman, Ibrahim Palm, who's the current chair of the World Bank Inspection Panel, and last but certainly not least, we have Orsolya Shekeli, who has served since 2020 as the head of the Dispute Resolution Service at the World Bank's Accountability Mechanism. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with some brief remarks from Param, and then we'll follow that with some remarks by Margot and Aaron. And then we're going to have about 25 minutes to ask some questions, because we understand Param has to leave us, unfortunately, at 11:50, so we want to make sure you're able to. You get grilled before you leave, exactly, yeah. And with that, I'll hand the floor over to you. Thanks.
Thanks very much, David, and it's great to be here with, I think, a very distinguished panel, and of course, all of you here who this is something which you do for a living, and so we're looking forward to hearing from you and getting your questions. So let me just talk a little bit about what is going on now, and what is the process which is being followed for, as David referred to, this look at potential integration of the three independent accountability mechanisms which we have in the bank: the inspection panel, the CAO, and the DRS. Now, so look, this thing essentially, as David mentioned, there is a move in the bank system itself, within the bank. I'm not talking of accountability, to really leverage each institution's comparative advantage to make a more effective World Bank group. And that's something which President Banga has been driving ever since he came, essentially to make the bank group better, bigger, more effective in all its aspects. And as David mentioned, part of that, a critical part of that, is to see how can we sort of integrate and get each wing of the bank to really work closely with the others and make the overall impact more effective for our client countries, right? We're trying to sort of improve development impact. And so in that regard, we are trying to, what Ajay has done, and the part which probably most of you are familiar with is the environment and social framework. So in that, there's now a common framework. Of course, each wing of the bank has its own their own process. So they will continue doing that, but it's under some one kind of broad unified framework. And then you've probably got some details about this. We have the makers and the checkers within the group. And so that effort is going on, and that's a separate thing which we can talk about, but you're probably going to hear more about that from someone like Maninder and Larissa. Maybe you already have, and we can discuss that separately. Now, in addition to that, from a management point of view, in case you didn't know, there's also an increasing move to have common representation at the country level. So right now we have country directors and managers in most of the countries from the World Bank Group. There's someone who represents the IFC, and MIGA has a couple of boots on the ground. Now there's an increasing move to have what we call joint country representation. And this has already happened now in 40 countries, where you have one manager who represents all three institutions of the bank, right? IBRD, IDA, MIGA, and IFC. And then, of course, at the back end, they get in touch with the respective organizations. So that has helped country clients, stakeholders, public sector, private sector. So that's on the one side. So now what's happening in now the independent accountability mechanisms work with the board, right? They don't work with management. They're independent of management. So about a year ago, we thought about this. It's a long-standing topic in the bank. From what I know, I've become the chair of CODI just about a year ago, but this been a topic of discussion for the last 10, 12 years of whether there is a need to make even the independent accountability mechanisms more effective in terms of addressing, what is the ultimate need out there, as you mentioned. How can we improve the lot of project-affected people in terms of their complaints, whether their grievances are being appropriately redressed, and to make sure that there is no dilution or regression. These are the words which we're using. So how do we need to do that? And if we need to do it, how do we do it? And what's the time frame? And it's an open discussion. So this topic came up at multiple levels. There was earlier an external review team which looked at some specific aspects of the earlier creation of the DRS and the inspection panel. They made a series of recommendations. One of those recommendations was a structural change in the relationship between the inspection panel and the DRS. So that the board took a decision last January. And so that has now been implemented, continues to be. In the meanwhile, the question then was, for 2 or 3 reasons, which I can share with you. One is it's also consistent with what the bank is doing internally in management in terms of trying to get a more integrated impact for our clients. The second was from a client country perspective, because there was a lot of feedback which came to the board. It's been coming is from a client country feedback or even from a project affected person feedback, is there is some confusion and lack of knowledge and awareness about the independent accountability mechanism of the bank. So they really don't know that the inspection panel deals with the public sector, the CAO deals with with IFC and MIGA, and then the DRS is relatively new. So again, lack of knowledge, lack of awareness. So there was some indication that it would be, to have some consistency, can we have some kind of single window concept? And that discussion came about from a client country perspective. Also, other multilateral development banks, some of them have got integrated public sector, private sector accountability mechanisms, others are different. So essentially the board felt, let's look at all this again and see whether it makes sense to approach this in any way, and to have obviously wide consultation with CSOs, with client countries, with other stakeholders to see what other people think as well. So there was a series of discussions both within CODI, the Committee on Development Effectiveness, at the board as well, formal, informal, etc. We had a series of seminars, and to the extent we could, we kept many CSOs in the loop. We had separate conversations, and so then finally the board decided that, I should mention that the three IAMs of the bank, the independent accountability mechanisms, they were sort of driving this from the beginning. So we had a discussion with them, and we felt it was really important for them to feel comfortable to have this conversation and to get their views. So we had all three of them. That was a committee which they led, where they came to the board with an approach paper on this. It's kind of concept note on how they saw this, what are the pros and cons. And so that was discussed with the board. We had a seminar, we call it an executive director seminar. And coming out of that, that was about 4 or 5 months ago, the board felt that it would be important to appoint a task force, sort of external task force, so that we wouldn't have any potential, even perceived conflict of interest within the accountability mechanisms within the bank. And this task force essentially was tasked with looking at this whole question, discussing it with management, with stakeholders, with all of you. And that process, so this task force was appointed a couple of months ago. And now they are talking both at a technical level, obviously with our independent accountability mechanisms within the bank. And then they are also reaching out to the other stakeholders. And soon they're going to go externally as well, where they will be having a series of discussions with external stakeholders, including all of you, client countries, all those who have an interest in this. So that's the process which is underway. The task force is working now. They have come up with an approach paper which has been shared with the board. That approach paper will be finalized over the next 4 to 6 weeks. And then on that basis, the task force will take their work forward. So that's broadly where we are. And so it's a good time now for you to ask your questions, share your concerns. I think the couple of key principles the task force is going to follow is we want to make sure that this is going to get better than it has been before. So there's and so the whole purpose of this is to improve the effectiveness of the accountability mechanism. And then, of course, we're talking directly about project beneficiaries or project affected people and how is it going to improve their lot. So I think that's a key principle underlying this whole exercise, which I wanted to make very clear. So maybe I can stop there, David, and happy to take questions, or let's hear from others what they have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Param. That was very helpful. I think we're going to go to Margot next, and then Aaron for some brief remarks, and then we'll open it up for questions. Go ahead, Margot.
Thank you. My name is Margot Day. I'm the Executive Director of Accountability Council, and we advocate with communities who live near or work at project sites. We'll hear from them on average once a week. We'll get a new request. When people are telling us that projects have missed their mark, have contributed to harm to their lives, livelihoods, and environment. And when we hear from people, we see how they can reach investors to change projects to prevent and mitigate and remediate harm. And what that means in practice is we're often using the independent accountability mechanisms that are attached to financial institutions. So I wanted to start us off by maybe just zooming out a little bit and just reminding everybody in kind of a common sense way why these accountability mechanisms matter, because there's a lot of jargon. This whole room is full of experts on accountability mechanisms, but kind of just at their most basic level, it's important to keep in mind that international financial institutions work in complex and difficult contexts and flawed systems, and sometimes even well-intentioned projects cause or contribute to harm to local communities and the environment. And when that happens, it's really the local communities that are bearing the most risk, right? It's their water that's polluted, it's their jobs that are taken away, it's their homes that are demolished, it's their health that's harmed. And the multilateral development banks are really, and the decision makers are really, really far away, right? So at its basics, the independent accountability mechanism is simply a way for if I live by a mine and it's poisoned my water, I can raise my hand and reach the people that paid for it, that made the decision for the project in the first place. And when those channels work, they can be transformative. It can mean that over the past 30 years, there's been almost 3,000 cases to independent accountability mechanisms. And when they work, it means that communities have protected their biodiversity, protected their environments, protected their jobs, protected their families, right? So these can be really transformative, important channels. And at their base are kind of these community-centered development tools. And so they matter a lot for communities, which is the perspective that I'm trying to represent today. But I also think we should be clear that the independent accountability mechanisms are really good for banks. And that's because local communities know a lot. Like, they know their local context of what development is going to work, and they're often the first to know if something goes off track because they feel it, they know the local context. And if they have trusted channels, they'll use it, they'll raise issues, and then the World Bank Group or any other investor would be able to hear from the local experts and make a change, right? Like, change how the project's happening, address whatever harm has happened so that there's truly a sustainable development project there and not a project that's externalized harm onto people and the planet. And so no matter what the World Bank Group's issue of the day is, whether it's jobs or climate or energy or agriculture, the bank needs local experts and needs local communities' voices to be able to have their money hit the mark, and that's what a good independent accountability mechanism does. And on top of that, the World Bank Group or other multilateral development banks benefit because accountability mechanisms are one of the reasons why they can claim immunity from lawsuits. So the World Bank Group will say you can't sue us over these environmental and social harms, and that's because we have an alternate fair justice channel that is our independent accountability mechanism. So as we're thinking about either improving the three mechanisms now or merging them into one, for the bank's own interests, it has to be good enough, it has to be fair for communities, because otherwise the lawsuits will and should come. So I think it's important for us then to kind of define what success looks like. And this too isn't actually that complicated, right? The trappings of an effective accountability mechanism, whether it's one for the whole World Bank Group or multiple, are well known. In this room with a bunch of experts on accountability, we can and do debate all the time, and we'll continue to do that kind of on the edge cases. What would be good for implementation? Can we improve? How can we have a next generation of accountability mechanisms? But the core requirements are really common sense, and you don't really even have to know that much about this field to kind of understand them. And it's is the mechanism well known by communities? Like you were saying, do people know that this mechanism exists? And is it easy to access? And when somebody's thinking about, should I file a complaint? Should I take this huge risk and, try to defend my local rights and my environment? Is it predictable? Do I know how the process is going to go? Can I kind of foresee what the outcomes are going to be? And when those outcomes come, are they actually fair, right? Did we understand what the harm was, and did we prevent or mitigate or remediate it? And then finally, are the banks learning from these cases, right? So if there's harm found in one case, you would think then the bank would learn or the client would learn to change their practices and policies so that harm doesn't happen in the future. So there's just so many technical things that I think come into this conversation, but really at its base, we're just looking for a fair justice channel that's going to serve communities as well as the institutions. But that's a high task, and there's a lot of barriers to success. if defining success is simple, I think achieving success is particularly difficult. And I don't want us to spend too much time on this panel focusing on the barriers, but I do think it's worth saying it's a pretty scary time to advocate for accountability right now. I mean, to just kind of context set a little bit, Powers never liked accountability, and the World Bank and the IFC have never liked its accountability mechanisms. There are really wonderful individuals at the World Bank Group that understand and are internal champions for accountability and know that when the mechanisms are strong, it means that you have true sustainable development. And I see those people and appreciate them. But when you're in these cases, every single case that Accountability Council has been a part of or advised on is a battle. There's pushback to be able to get any type of accountability, any type of remedy, and too often, even when communities go all the way through the process, they're telling us that they feel like they're still worse off, right? So putting these practices in place is an exceptionally high task we have ahead of ourselves. I also think this language around efficiency is a hurdle that we need to name. I think efficiency can be used as a weapon to cut the good and keep the bad. And if the World Bank Group is really wanting to do transformative, impactful investments in complex environments within extractive systems and don't want to do any harm, there has to be some slowing down and oversight and accountability, right? There has to be, you can't pursue efficiency at all costs or it's going to contribute to more harm. And so the accountability system that we put in place, or as we reform the existing one, it has to cost money, it has to take time. It can't just be of efficiency over effectiveness. I'll just quickly mention two other barriers. This is kind of the understatement of the day, but the current political climate is a barrier to accountability. The Trump administration not being a fan of multilateralism, human rights, or the environment. So if we're taking on this important ambition to make sure that the World Bank Group's accountability mechanisms can meet the moment, we're doing it in a particularly egregious and difficult time. And the decision-making, even in any political climate, no matter who's the president down the street or in any era of the World Bank, when World Bank systems are put into place, the decision-makers are largely people far away from the issues, and those people who are going to decide what the accountability system looks like aren't necessarily the people that are using it. And so I think we have to recognize that kind of exclusive decision-making as a barrier too. So we need to succeed. We have a ton of barriers. And so what's the solution? How do we actually overcome those barriers? And I think it's exactly what you said in that it's setting strong principles from the beginning, right? So if we can set the right guiding principles to mitigate those risks, then this can be a time that we take on this important project of improving the World Bank's accountability mechanisms. So I would agree with that principle, and I'm happy to hear it about no regression, right? No dilution. Let's keep everything good at the three mechanisms right now, and whether it's combined or separate, those are the floor. But the other three principles that I would ask the board and management and the IAMs to consider is, in addition to setting that floor, we have to set a high ambition that this should be the best accountability mechanisms that exist. If the World Bank Group wants to be the best development bank, it has to have the strongest accountability mechanism to underpin its ambitions. People who are impacted have to be part of that design process and their local advocates. And then ultimately, the fourth principle I want to mention that I haven't heard as much is that we really have to trust the independent accountability mechanism staff and give them the pen to decide what processes are going to work. So it does give me pause when I hear about multiple task forces and a lot of different people involved. I think it can become overly legalistic, overly complex, but really we have to trust independent accountability mechanism staff to know what they're doing to remain independent and to put a good process in place. So it's going to be hard. It's worth it. Hopefully, the bank can consider those guiding principles as it considers next steps. I think it would make a world of difference to put the right accountability mechanism in place. Thanks.
Yeah. Go ahead, Aaron.
Good morning. Again, I'm Aaron Pedrosa from the Philippines, and I've been coming here, I feel like a fixture already, in the World Bank. And it's been 8 years. Briefly, just to recap and to recall what we've been doing. We filed a case in 2017. No? 5 days ago, it turned 8 years old against the IFC for investing in through its financial subsidiary, financial intermediary, Rizal Commercial Banking Corporation, 19 coal plants across the Philippines. And in 2021, the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman decided in our favor. A year later, a management action plan was approved by the board. And 3 years since the approval of that management action plan, remedies remain elusive to affected communities. You know, we keep coming here to the meetings, from the springs to the annuals. From the standpoint of affected communities, our motivations are remedies and justice. This shouldn't be the case if only investments were done according to the performance standards of the IFC. But that's already after the fact. No? Communities devastated by World Bank investments have, at the onset, been invisible, from project scoping to preparation to construction until even to the operation stage. Almost never consulted, almost never considered in the entire project planning, design, and implementation. So that when complaints arise, it is only then that they are really placed on the radar, that they become visible. In the case of RCBC, 10 communities across the Philippines continue to suffer direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts of IFC's intermediated finance. You might ask, why 10 of the 19? Because only 10 were ultimately found eligible. After springs this year, meaning the spring meetings here in Washington, D.C., an indigenous peoples community was demolished in Mindanao. Coal ash continued to be dumped in a river in Visayas, and that is just next to a protected seascape. And health impacts continue to devastate communities in Luzon. So these are the projects scattered across the Philippines: 5 in Luzon, 2 in Visayas, 3 in Mindanao. In fact, I would just want to share with you the documentation we've done. This details the worsening impacts experienced by the 10 communities who to this day do not have remedies, do not have access to the remedies that they have been yearning for. 8 years since we filed a complaint, it feels like the World Bank is doing everything it can except be accountable for its harmful investments. With the potential integration of the accountability mechanisms, we refuse to be a mere lesson learned. Integrating must mean effective, efficient, non-regressive outcomes, not in business terms, but in terms of environment, human rights, accountability. This should also be true whether or not integration happens. For instance, if information was inaccessible during the project design, implementation, construction, and operation, through recourse to the accountability mechanism, information should be already accessible. The management action plans, or the MAPs, ironically, that's how it's called, MAPs, should locate communities, remedies to those devastated by the investments. But our experience tell otherwise. So we ask, will the integration integrate communities' lived experiences? Will it deliver justice and remedies? Will it end the 8 years of suffering of people's affected communities, or project-affected peoples in the Philippines? Merger or not, communities, remedies, justice should be the bottom line. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for those powerful remarks and for really grounding this discussion in the experience and the perspective of affected communities who are struggling for redress. That's what this is all about. Sure. So I want to kick off the questions with a question for you, Param. And I think it's the question that's on everyone's minds, which is why? Why this? Why now? What is the problem we're trying to solve with this consolidation process exactly. I was really happy to hear you say that the purpose is to improve the effectiveness of the accountability mechanisms. That's a great purpose. I think we would all share that goal. We want to see more effective accountability system at the World Bank Group. But I guess the question is, why do you think a consolidated mechanism would achieve that goal?
Okay, so I touched upon this a little bit. So let me try to sort of clarify again. And first of all, I think it's a good question which many people have asked. Why this? Why now? My information is that actually this discussion has been going on for many years. So it's not new. For at least 10 years, this topic has come up for discussion. And I think there were a couple of reasons why the discussions kind of got initiated. So first of all, let me make it clear, and I completely agree with Margot and with Aaron. Look, there's always scope for improvement. So, whether it's within the bank or whether it's the accountability mechanisms. So it's an opportunity to make it better and more effective. And from the primary lens, I would say, there are other lenses as well of improving. You asked some good questions, Aaron. Is it going to integrate affected people by bank projects? Are they going to be integrated into this process in terms of consultation and decisions taken? And the answer is yes. So we want to make this so, and those key principles of no dilution, no regression, I think they're at the heart of this. The question then is, how do you come up with a world-class or a state-of-the-art accountability mechanism? And there, the issue of integration came in. Will that lead to that? And a couple of underlying reasons for that. So the feedback we have been getting from a client country perspective, and all of you have been working directly with communities, is that while the CSO community may be aware about these three different things, different units within the bank, the accountability mechanisms, the IP, the CSO, and the DRS and the CAO. There are other stakeholders. There are client governments at subnational level, but there are most of all project affected people who don't know about this. So for example, if you have an IFC IBRD project, and there are a few of these. There's a big one coming up in Bhutan, a hydroelectric project, in case you didn't know, I'm sure you'll find out, which is IFC IBRD IDA, right? Now, if something goes wrong or beneficiaries are affected, now what do they do? Who do they go to? Is it a CAO thing? Is it an inspection panel thing? Where does the DRS come in? So there are issues like that. And with increasing integration within the bank system, this is going to become more and more common. So that's one sort of reason why this discussion got kickstarted. In addition to that, there is, again, as you mentioned and I mentioned, complementary to the integration effort within the bank. Another reason. So, does this also need to? It was an opportunity to relook at it, right? Given within the bank. So now, from an independent accountability mechanism point of view, does it make sense to look at it again, kind of de novo? The discussion's been going on. It's an opportunity. And then some of the other, we have had some conversations with other MDBs who are thinking about the same. Some of them already have some kind of integration. Others are looking at it again. So overall, and we're looking at another point, what we call an FMR, a full mutual reliance framework, which we've done with ADB. So, and we're looking to do it with other MDBs. So these were all opportunities for this topic to kind of re-emerge, if you like. And that's why it came back on the table. And look, here again, the question is, does it make sense, right? Is it going to make it better? Is it going to improve the lot of project beneficiaries? Those are critical questions which we're looking at. And this is not being rushed through anything. So we're taking it one step at a time. There are some key principles. And if it becomes better because of integration, then and with the feedback of everyone, including all of you, then that's a decision which the board will take.
Great. Thank you, Bahram. I think we all share the goal of doing this only if it leads to a better mechanism and a better system. And a part of that is this key principle that you mentioned of no dilution, no regression. It's not going to be better if certain aspects of the current mechanisms and policies that govern those mechanisms move backwards in a consolidation. So it's great to hear that you have this principle of no regression, no dilution as one of the guiding North Stars for this process.
Very much.
But I want to kind of put a finer point on that and ask, let's take a specific example. So, because I think we can all have different ideas about what no regression actually means, and the devil's kind of in the details, right? So the CAO, I think, is one of the most accessible accountability mechanisms in the whole IAM ecosystem. And it's so accessible because it has a fairly low bar to eligibility. That means that it's easy for affected communities to get in the door, to have their issues addressed either through dispute resolution or through a compliance appraisal. Higher bar for a compliance investigation. But just getting in the door and accessing dispute resolution in particular, very low bar to eligibility. The World Bank accountability mechanism, on the other hand, has a much higher bar to eligibility, which makes it less accessible to communities. Many fewer cases at the World Bank accountability mechanism than the CAO. So does no regression mean that the CAO eligibility criteria is going to prevail in a consolidated mechanism?
As you said, you're now getting into detail about some very specific aspects of the definition of no regression. I think it's a key principle. I think all this is going to be looked at. We have made it very clear, and the board has made it very clear. The members have made it clear, and we have a member of the task force here. So I don't want to put Charles on the spot, but you can put questions to him as well because they're going through this process. But again, we have agreed on no regression. Now, as you said, there are differences between the way the CAO approaches it and the way the inspection panel approaches this issue. And all that is going to be looked at. So everything is on the table.
Maybe someone has a follow-up. Maybe we can also put Charles on the spot, too, if anyone wants to ask him a question. But we'll open it up for the audience. We've got about 13 more minutes before you have to head off. So. Please.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. My name is Arome Salifu. I work for Africa Youth Growth Foundation in Nigeria. We're also in Kenya and Zambia. We actually work with the World Bank. We have implemented a nutrition project in Nigeria for the World Bank across 3 states. So we are going to be talking from a point of understanding of how the banking projects are actually being managed. I think fundamentally he says something very important. When projects have actually been designed, the beneficiaries and the communities are not incorporated, and so they are disconnected from the very foundation. Now, they're only spotted from the point of grievance. And when and if these are reported, hardly do we get any feedback from your report. So what are the existing reports that you've generated, and how have they been channeled properly to get to the people, to guarantee the feedback and the application of the feedback in your subsequent actions or reactions? Thank you.
Clarify, you're referring to investigation reports that come out of the mechanisms?
Sorry?
Are you referring to the investigation reports that come out of the mechanisms?
Yeah.
Okay. We'll take a couple more questions and then, please.
Hi, good morning. Rebecca Aberg, Inclusive Engagement International and BPKS, an organization of persons with disabilities in Bangladesh. It was mentioned earlier that there is an external task force, and I was wondering if you could, or maybe the colleague from the task force could get into who is on this task force, how were they selected, and what is their mandate? Thank you.
Dustin? In the back.
Thank you. My name is Dustin Schiff. I work for Urgewald in Germany. I would have a question on, Param, you have mentioned that everything is on the table. I was wondering, I've looked at the mechanisms and the question to which extent they are able actually to trigger organizational learning within the institutions, and which are the factors actually that improve that or even hamper that. And research suggests, from my perspective, even my own research, if I may say that, that the most barriers lie not within the mechanisms, but in the institutional and political environment. And I was wondering, because I'm not aware of the terms of references for the expert group, that whether you also look at the institutional environment of the mechanisms in order to enable them actually to do what they should do, contribute to organizational learning, contribute to remedy, and make sure that the grievances will be addressed. Thanks.
Right. So on the reports, the investigation reports, on that one, I'd probably have to defer to one of the IAMs in terms of how they function, so they can let you know. I think everything is in the public domain, but maybe one of the IAM chairs could respond to that. The second one on the task force. So what I can tell you is that this task force. So the discussion was we need to have a dedicated task force. And preferably from people outside the institution, but who obviously are sector experts and people of high credibility and impeccable reputations. So there are two members of the task force, right? One of them, Charles, is here. David is not here today. And just to let you know, this came from a pool of names recommended to the board by the 3 accountability mechanisms. So basically, they gave us a list of names of people they thought who could do this work credibly. And so then the board made a determination and they were selected. So that's the process. The task force has been constituted and they are currently working, and maybe Charles can tell you a little bit about that if he wants to. So that's on the task force. The last question on the task force, I wasn't very clear when you said it depends on the institutional environment. Is that of the bank? You meant within the World Bank? Sure. So I think, the president has made it very clear on a couple of occasions that this is led by the board. This is not a management initiative. And irrespective of what is happening within the bank, which is integrating ESF and bringing together all the sort of wings of the bank, the accountability mechanism basically engages with the board. It's the board's responsibility. And as CODI, we sort of, on a more day-to-day basis, we engage with them on behalf of the board. So as far as the institutional environment of the board, there's been a lot of discussion, if that's of any concern, a lot of discussion within CODI, within the entire board, because this is a topic which is of interest to all 25 executive directors. CODI, we are 8 members, but there are some topics which are sort of more CODI specific or interest, and others which are of interest to the entire board. So this topic of how this thing is moving forward is of interest to the entire board. The task force is meeting each member of the board. They're also they're talking to stakeholders, obviously within the bank, because there's a part of the bank which deals with the accountability mechanism, the ESF folks in particular. And now, once the approach paper is finalized, there's a draft out there which is currently being looked at. They're going to engage externally. So there's a whole a ring of external consultations being planned. And, those details will come out soon. I hope that helps.
Hi, thank you. Anthony Cotton, UN Human Rights. Any integration of the 3 mechanisms will inevitably lead to some sort of process change. And so my question is, what principles and practices do you think are important to follow to protect the interests of communities that are already mid-process with one of the existing mechanisms? And are these considerations included in the approach paper, or will they be explored by the task force? Thank you.
Question can go to Greg.
Thank you, Greg Berry from Accountability Council. So I'm operating on the assumption that this is still a will they, won't they, because it's a potential integration. And you've identified an issue in this will they, won't they scenario, and it was identified by the client countries that there's confusion as to which mechanism is available to communities. So I'm wondering, in the interim, or if this never happens, what can be done to address that confusion, given that the mechanisms stay apart? Can more resources be dedicated to IAM outreach and also disclosure of the IAMs at the project level during consultation?
I think we could probably take one more question, and then we'll turn it back over to Param. Was there one here?
Hello, I'm Thomas Ward. I'm an economist. I was here at the World Bank for 10 years. I'm also an anti-money laundering specialist and looked at through the systems and everything else. One thing we got to be very careful about is not play politics and calling out the U.S. administration. If you look at the U.S. Treasury report of last April, which I have a copy of, and you guys can get, it clearly states things got to get done and cleaned up and better. So yes, how do we deal with this? This issue has been going on for 20-some years, and it's clearly is not getting addressed and cleaned up, as you can see with the people here.
Thank you. I think there was a question on, what's going to happen inevitably at some point if this moves forward. You'll get into policies, processes, people. So I think, that's going to be probably part two, assuming that, you spoke about will they, won't they. So that's, as I said, it's all on the table. They're looking at it with an open mind. And in fact, in our first interaction with the task force, they wanted members of CODI and the board to confirm that actually there was an open mind, and we said yes. And, you can confirm that with the task force. On the second question, I think it's an important question to clarify. See, the IAMs are functioning. Nothing has stopped. So in some ways, it's an ongoing, this thing is parallel to what is already going on, right? And so it's important to clarify that. Again, if any improvements can be made within the existing system in terms of clarifying to communities that there are these three things, more outreach, etc. So that there's absolutely. So whatever's going on, it's worked pretty effectively so far. I mean, no one is questioning that. I mean, the three AMs have done an outstanding job. The only effort is to see whether we can, go to another level. And so if more outreach is required, there's an executive secretary who's working with the DRS and the inspection panel. Communication is important. So, and the three AMs work very closely together. So if anything more needs to be done, it should be done while this is going on in parallel. Is that okay?
Yeah, I think so. Did that answer all the questions? I think we've got a few minutes left, so I might just use my chair's privilege to ask you one last question before you head out the door.
Sure.
Aaron spoke about the RCBC case. It's a case that my organization has also been working on together with PMCJ for the last 8 years. And as you heard, 8 years on, 3 years after a map was approved by the board, still no outcomes for affected people, still no remedy. And I think one thing a conclusion that we have come to in looking at the potential remedial actions that could be implemented to address the harms on the ground, what communities are calling for, are things that actually would better be handled by the World Bank, by the public sector side, with its relationship with the Philippine government. Basically, what we need is a one World Bank group approach to remedy. So the IFC has adopted now its interim remedial action framework, which we're all very happy has finally happened. If we're going to have a one World Bank integrated ENS management, if we're going to have a one World Bank consolidated accountability mechanism, are we going to have a one World Bank remedial action framework as well?
Look, it's a great question. As you said yourself, so the IFC, we approved the remedial action framework for IFC. And in many ways, you're sort of echoing the point I was making, is that if you're looking at IFC and the bank, and we have said, no regression, no dilution. If part of this leads to an integrated remedial action framework, to me, prima facie, that would make sense. I mean, this case you're sounding, obviously things seem to have gone south, and maybe Janine can share more details about that. I'm sure the institution has tried its best to address it. So that could well be part of these conversations.
You heard it here. We've taken notes. Thank you, Param. You've been very generous with your time. We appreciate you coming and answering the hard questions.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, I think with that, we will move to the second phase of this discussion, which is to hear from the leaders of our accountability mechanisms. I've got a couple questions I want to kick off with for each of the accountability leaders, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So I actually want to start with you, Ibrahim, as the chair of the original accountability mechanism in the world, of the grandfather of the independent accountability mechanisms. I would really like to hear how the three of you are coordinating on this, and what role do you expect that the mechanisms are going to play in this board process? I also want to know if you're all on the same page, frankly, about those core principles that need to guide this process when we think about actually not just integrating the mechanisms, but integrating the policies that govern the mechanisms.
Thanks very much, David. I think that's really at the core of how we have approached this. If you'll allow me, just to recognize another panel member who is here with us, Ajay, not Ajay the president, but Ajay Deshpande, who's here, and also a former chair of the inspection panel, who probably is the longest serving former chair, Dr. Gonzalo Castro de la Mata. Thank you for coming, Gonzalo. As you know, the inspection panel obviously is been in existence since '93, and there are a number of things that I would probably respond to in questions further. But you give me the opportunity to speak on behalf of the three mechanisms, which really shouldn't be my place to do. But I think in terms of coordination, we have worked rather closely together since the beginning of this process. In fact, initially, and I think Param did mention this, the mechanisms, the three of us, were actually involved in sort of scoping out the history, the origins, the evolution of accountability at the World Bank. And we had an expert working group of colleagues from within the three mechanisms who sort of provided to codate the main elements of what we anticipate should be of primary consideration in this potential integration. And colleagues worked very hard to deliver on this from all three mechanisms, looking at particularly areas of policy difference, areas of potential policy integration, And I think the idea about reaching the highest standard was always sort of what we were looking at, to see this as an opportunity to elevate the standards of all three mechanisms. And if you consider that the inspection panel resolution is literally the same since 1993, whereas the CAO has evolved its policy and its processes, I think there's a lot of scope for us to sort of reach those standards with access, and you've talked about that, which is really important, but also with remedy. And I think, speaking of remedy, what is interesting is that the inspection panel has, over the years, attained a very high level of remedial action. And I think Accountability Council's recent report shows that in our cases, 78% of our cases result in some remedial action. Clearly, the goal should be 100%. I mean, remedy is justice, and I think Aaron made that point very clearly. The goal of any compliance process should result in remedy. It should result in justice. Otherwise, what's the point, really, isn't it? So I think in terms of our coordination, we're really working closely together. And I do appreciate my colleagues, Janine and Osolia, and our teams for working in this collaborative manner. And we are committed to supporting the outcomes that work best for communities. We are the face of the bank with communities in terms of addressing their adverse impacts. And our commitment is largely due to that outward-facing, community-centered approach that we come to this with.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ibrahim. I don't know if Janine or Celia, you want to add to that, since I asked about the coordination, and if you're all on the same page, feel free to jump in.
Well, I think it's literally we have to coordinate. It's working. Okay. I think coordination happens in multiple levels, so we coordinate regularly with regards to our daily work, which is ongoing, and as Param has mentioned, it's very important to us that we maintain the same standards and quality which we have aspired to in the past years as we are discussing potential changes moving forward. We have, of course, all the cooperation with regards to outreach and including with all of you or many of you, and that's something that we would like to not only continue but enhance, as I fully agree that we can do a lot more in terms of how we disseminate information as is currently. But also we coordinate with regards to this process, not only among ourselves, but the teams, but also with the task force. And in one of the last meetings, we actually recommended to the experts, meet all of us, don't even meet us bilaterally, but it's very important that we meet all together and we have the chance to hear each other. Whether we agree or not agree, it only comes out during those discussions, but obviously disagreement, as a conflict resolution expert, I swear by, because it gives opportunity for new solutions to be found. So I think in many ways, we hope to have these discussions very much so moving forward as well. And we are rather frequently asked to have these discussions with the board itself, so which we also at the same time welcome, but we highlighted in the budget process that this puts a huge burden on our capacities internally. So we actually need to recognize that workload which we are putting into these processes as we move forward. But I think that answers probably in more detailed way. Yes, we cooperate in a very close manner. That doesn't mean that as we move into the substantive discussions as to how processes and case-based examples should be serving very much so these discussions in terms of how substantive changes should happen, there might be differences how we see things. And that's where I think it's also very important that at some point stakeholder consultation comes into the picture in various phases and contributes to those discussions. That's why we are all here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ursula. And the reason why I ask the question, are you on the same page, is because I fear, and I think my fears may probably shared by a lot of people here, that if you're not on the same page about the core principles that should guide this process. As the leaders of the accountability mechanisms, then the risks are likely to outweigh the benefits as this thing proceeds. And that leads me to the question that I wanted to ask you, Janine, which is, how do you see the risks versus the benefits of integration? And what more do you think is needed to create a world-class, best-in-class accountability, super accountability mechanism at the World Bank Group?
Thanks very much. I really take to heart the concept of best in class. So when I think of opportunities we've heard this morning, and I've heard from you what you see as opportunities, process improvements like a single point of entry, standardized, access possibilities, greater visibility. We heard the issue of, well, we don't know where to go. Do we go to a CAO? Do we go to inspection panel DRS? But I have to say also, one thing that I see a lot is that many communities don't even know that something's being financed by IFC or MIGA. I don't know if that's the case with the World Bank. So part of it is also greater visibility. And that doesn't happen on its own. There has to be a targeted effort to increase that awareness and knowledge. But I would say where I think I'd like to speak to is this issue of greater institutional coherence and opportunity for impact. I think that is a benefit that could be realized if there's a decision to go forward. And I would say there are about 3 areas where this greater coherence, policy coherence, and impact can be. One has to do with precisely what you raised, which is the One World Bank approach to remedy. I think we could need to see a closer link between accountability and remedy. I really took to heart when I heard Aaron say that we're tired of being useful as an example for lesson learned. There's got to be more than just lessons learned in this, correct? And we know, I can only speak for CAO, there are so many, particularly compliance cases. I think in dispute resolution we have better odds. 50% of our cases have actually successful dispute resolution outcomes. 50% of them go to compliance. But I'd say on the compliance side is where we see a steady decline in actual meaningful improvements on the ground. And of course, the Accountability Council's most recent report shows that this is a systemic issue, that there's a big gap still, the remedy gap is still very much alive and looming in the context of our work that has to be addressed. And potentially, if we do this right, we can get that linked together so that it's a framework, but also there's a greater clarity on what is expected from the institutions themselves, the parent institutions, not just the accountability mechanisms, in terms of delivering that remedy. A couple of other points I think where we can have some benefits is also, having integration can also incorporate and look at where do we have blind spots? Are there areas, for example, global environmental services, such as biodiversity, right down to the CO policy, even though I'd like to think it's today's best in class, that is something that you're not allowed to bring forward. If it's a global environmental good. Why not? Why in this area, in this world today, in this century, where we're seeing kind of these things crumble around us, are we still saying that there's no place for that in the accountability world? I don't know, and that's something that could be addressed. Also strengthening the access to information and transparency. But these are the hopes, I think, and dreams, right? And what does it take to make them real? And I think it goes back to something Param said and you said and also Ibrahim here, and that is the principles. No dilution, ensuring that there are no provisions that weaken independence, that narrow the scope or reduce access and so forth. There are also risks of transitional disruption, which has been raised by one of our members of the audience here. And of course, there's a risk that there may be some inherent differences when you process accountability for public and private sector. And so The principles here really are important, the no regression, the transparency, outcome-focused integration, really focusing on the outcome, kind of stakeholder-centered, and then, of course, commitment to improving access to remedy. These can maximize, I think, our chances of getting a better, a next generation, as it were, accountability 3.0. But I think this is really your job to monitor and measure the application of these principles. Because it's one thing to say, we've adopted the principles. I know in my own life every morning I wake up with a good set of intentions and principles. In the course of the day, it gets a little ragged. And I think that, you know, in the fray of things, when you start trying to actually negotiate or develop a new policy, sometimes these principles can get stretched a little bit or set aside. So I think this is really your role, is to monitor and measure the application of these principles.
Our role and your role. Yeah.
True,
Thank you.
true, but
Thank you, Janine. I'd like to turn to you again, Orsilia, as the sole dispute resolution specialist on the panel. Are there special concerns for dispute resolution when, you know, bringing together mechanisms that serve both the public and the private sector? It would be great if you could speak to that. And then also, I'd like if you could follow up on the point that Janine raised about the risks around the transitional period and disruptions during that period. Any special considerations that we should be thinking about to preempt and address concerns about the transition period, if there is a consolidation?
Yes, indeed. And I think it's both questions are very good. And I maybe start with the transitional measures. I think, first of all, I would like to move away from DRS being new, because I think we can now see that, yes, indeed, it has been bringing something new to the institution. And I think we need to understand what those new elements were: borrower more engaged, the agency for the requesters to discuss their cases. But that said, I think now we can say that it is there and it's established. It has had 3 closed cases and outcomes, so we can build on a lot of lessons learned and experiences which are already there. So that's the good thing, because I think it would have been much more difficult if we don't have those. And please do read the report as well. But that said, I think we have seen not only as we establish the services, these differences between the public and the private sector, but also we had a case, as you know, Cameroon Nachtigal case, which was a very closely coordinated case with CAO DR, and I look at Knox out there and Alma here, where we had very practical lessons as to what are the challenges of bringing together different policies in this regard, different entry points, different phasing in the processes, but also different timelines, and attached to those timelines, different capacities within the individual services as to how they did this. So these are just a few examples of very concrete, actual things that would need to be brought together. But I also listened very carefully to Janine's presentation once in the board. I think there was one in the threats and reprisals as to what are the differences, how we can approach some things in the private sector. We can more openly publish with regards to a public sector entity, while in the public sector maintaining relations, you're in a much more difficult situation to talk about these things openly, and it has to be handled with various other tools. Or power imbalance, how you approach, or even just looking at who can be just ignored or put on a blacklist in terms of private sector, not so much when you have a public sector entity. Or when it comes to cases, how do you use public sector leverage? And then I think Janine mentioned quite often before that in some private sector cases, public sector leverage is extremely important, and how DR can contribute to that is something we need to look at. But I think it's also important not to dilute mandates. And with the clear mandates comes responsibility. So there's very clear responsibility a public sector entity, a borrower, has to do if we know these are the mandates, this is what you signed, this is what you need to comply with. And so we don't want those dilution to happen as we move forward and put a potential merger or integration or closer coordination. So I think, as with the ESF, we have heard before, there will be possibilities of potentially making more harmonized processes, and I think one of the things is the entry point, more easy access to DR. It simply does not make any sense not to try problem solving or trying to find solutions first, especially if something comes out of already discussions at the project level between management and the requesters. So it's common sense. You could do something more efficiently there. But at the same time, I think it's important that not only those structural changes drive these discussions, but actual lessons learned from cases and about these differences between the public and private sector. So I hope that that answers your question, but I'm happy to dig into more details because you probably have more nuanced questions out there with regards to this. I would like to highlight though one thing. What is really important that DR is just more than actual case solutions found and remedy found in a given case. What DR has brought about in the institution, it has brought about a change. A borrower is engaged. Before that was not so much the case. It was management on the other side. So how does that change dynamics inside the bank, but also with the borrower and in new project planning? And I think we can draw on lessons learned maybe coming out from Nepal and how that contributed to future stakeholder engagement, capacities built, etc. But I think it's also very important that DR has, and we discussed this last week at the IMNet annual meetings, DR has brought about various tools that could be beneficial also, for example, at the end of a compliance investigation. When you discuss a map, how do you do stakeholder engagements if there is no trust? So building trust, contributing to trust building, what are those lessons learned that you can take from DR towards that? So I would like to broaden the scope a little bit of our mindsets when it comes to using the various tools, so it actually can also help each other.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Marcelia. I think I'll open it up now to the audience to ask any questions you have for the panel. Over here. Thanks.
Hello. Hi. Thank you so much. My name is Yasmin. I'm with the Global Environment Facility, work on a conflict resolution there. I have a question about outside of the bank. Accountability mechanisms in other institutions. How are you working with those? Is there any kind of learning coordination among those institutions? Because there are also joint projects, joint investments, and even if there aren't in different communities, there might be ways to learn, especially regarding remedial action. And I also wanted to ask Janine about the global environmental goods that she commented on. The bank now has a loss on damage fund based on what's happening in international negotiations. But outside of that, there can be damages at the global environmental commons level. And what is the internal discussion around those? Remedial action, does that include impacts on environmental damages in addition to what the communities are facing, but maybe evaluation of what's happening to ecosystem services and then compensation for those, et cetera?
Surely there's more questions for this group. Here.
Thank you. My name is Latif Johar. I'm from Balochistan. I am a member of Human Rights Council of Balochistan. My question is about the accessibility and easy approach to the mechanisms and how communities are impacted can get in contact with you or your organization, and how you guys measure the risk they are doing it, because if it's just headquarter based, it's just one portion or one farm, someone in English or French, whatever language is it, and they can fix it. Is there this mechanism is available to every country where IMF's headquarter is, or especially where IMF or World Bank paying the money, the loans for specific projects, like big projects, they pay billions of dollars. Like I can example Barrick Gold, or my own country's Canada's company, and the Recordec mining project in Balochistan. So people, particularly minings are happening mostly in rural areas. Some people there, like my parents never went to school. They don't speak any other language except their mother language. How you can make it accessible, you can make it easy for those people, not only to talk to you, to explain their challenges, but also how you make sure they are safe, because I don't know if your money is being paid to those security forces, like hundreds of security forces being deployed for that, and people are daily being abducted and killed, and how they can talk about the challenges. What are these mechanisms? What these mechanisms involve for those peoples? And because I know, like I spent my entire life, still I'm struggling to understand the mechanism, how complexity we have, how expensive they are. And people go study 6 and 8 years, become a lawyer, they still struggle to argue with you, your organization, and because you, I'm just saying you because I'm facing you. You have more experts, you have more lawyers, you have more resources, but the local people have nothing. How we can make it easy to provide justice, and also make sure accountability at the higher level is acceptable for everyone. Thank you.
We've got some good questions on the table, so let's start with those. We've got accountability mechanisms at other institutions, how you're working together with them, sharing lessons. Also a question about global environmental goods for Janine. And then this last question about accessibility, how affected communities learn about these mechanisms and their ability to file complaints, and how to actually make it easier to translate those complaints into justice and remedial action. Okay, do you want to start, Janine?
Sure, I'm happy to start. And Ibrahim, maybe you can talk about the coordination and the work we do together because of the IM and whatever. So I'll just respond to the global environmental public good. So right now the CO policy says that if you are concerned about a project that IFC or MIGA is financing that is causing damage to kind of biodiversity as a global concern, as opposed to I am impacted in my village or in my town, you cannot, you have no standing in the context of the CO policy. And now that makes sense, obviously, in the sense that we want to help communities who are affected. But what we're also seeing is biodiversity, all these global systems are basically, as I said, crashing down around us. And it doesn't make any sense to me of why, say, somebody in India couldn't raise a concern about a global environmental good being damaged by an activity in another country, or even in another part of India, just because it's going to have an impact on the ozone layer, or it's going to have an impact on, say, biodiversity. I think climate, we can say fairly safely that there's not a living body on this planet that's not affected by climate change, so you could argue that you're already affected. But anyway, that's what I meant by that.
Speak to the coordination.
Yeah, so thank you for the question on coordination. I think there are three levels at which I could address that. And one is and maybe you're aware of the full mutual reliance framework that's been drawn up between the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. I think Param alluded to that earlier. In the context of that, we do have a cooperation agreement between the inspection panel and the compliance review panel at the ADB. Even prior to that, we have coordinated on joint investigations on some cases, including very recently a case in India, which is on our website, the Amravati Capital Development. And in doing that, what we're doing is identifying common standards. We know that our policies are different. There will be in the future perhaps some sort of harmonization going forward in terms of our policies. But even within those differences, identifying the common standards that we agree on and a common approach to conducting our compliance reviews. But then that's on a case-based level, but also at the level of the full mutual reliance between our two institutions. And that's going to become even more common as there's a push by G20 for greater harmonization between MDBs and so on. But then also there's coordination between the World Bank Group accountability mechanisms, where we have cases that may be of commonly assigned to us. I think with the dispute resolution service, obviously our process, and I think Osolia has sort of talked about the need for requesters to have access and choice between dispute resolution and compliance. Our process does involve, the entry of the dispute resolution as a choice at some level where we have conducted the eligibility assessment, and that's been approved by the board. In a potential integration, it could be that there will be earlier access to dispute resolution where that is the choice of the requester. But also there's coordination at the level of the Independent Accountability Mechanisms Network, which is across all institutions, including MDBs and other development finance institutions, bilateral, etc. And in fact, we just came out of the annual meeting last week, where increasingly we're talking about how to better collaborate in sharing lessons in policy reviews that are pending within our institutions, but also in common standards around self-assessment, around even peer reviews between our institutions. So there is a increasingly higher level of collaboration between IAMs across institutions. And I know David used the term super accountability mechanism, which draws this, image of what could be in the future, a high level of coordination, maybe even one mechanism, as Professor Bradlow has proposed. But this is where sort of our coordination and our increasing harmonized approaches to our work sits.
Rosalia, do you want to tack on the
access question?
Yeah.
Yes, I love the question, so I think I volunteer to answer. First of all, it's a huge achievement and brave step for any community member to reach out and to highlight harm, especially in the public sector context when they think on the other side is someone very powerful. And I'm not saying that it's always the case, because we have the other side where the borrower might think you as community members are very powerful if you are in the hundreds trying to highlight harm in a development context. But I think it's important that it's a very brave step. So we do everything to facilitate whatever we can. But it was one of my first meetings with civil society colleagues here, where we discussed it cannot be only CSOs and only the accountability mechanisms who are trying to disseminate information. We are simply far too few, far too limited resources, and frankly, very limited in our global outreach to be able to do this alone. So we have been relentlessly highlighting this and working with management and the bank itself to say, somehow this needs to be improved, that information is provided early on, in not only in project documents, but basically voluntarily by the teams in the ground or on the ground and in the field offices. And we also had a number of sessions through ECR colleagues where we simply informed colleagues in the bank as to we exist and how we exist and what they can do to inform people of this. Of course, there are very serious barriers. One is language, so we have also tried to overcome this by simply making our materials available in visual ways. So altogether cutting out language and making it understood how a mechanism can be accessed, or that at all we exist, because the very first step to people at all thinking of us is a simple step, which basically there are these mechanisms out there. Once you reach out to us, then it's our responsibility to explain the process as simple terms as possible, and to facilitate that process by making your job easy and not requiring, as you said, very complex documents and proofs to be submitted, but we do our job to facilitate the various processes. In the DR context, we have developed capacity building programs, or CSOs, because we realized it's a challenge to move away from advocacy role to a DR slower facilitative role. So we recognize that it's also our duty to somehow make this capacity building available. And in cases, we also have often built-in capacity building elements where we feel, for example, power imbalance is preventing requesters or communities from expressing what they wish, or simply to improve stakeholder communication by a government agency who has been previously just all about hierarchy and pressure. So I think these are the various steps we can do. We are also very clear about what we cannot do. So we don't have security attachment to us. We cannot provide effective protection to the people, and I think we also are responsible by highlighting these elements in the course of the case, so we don't raise the bar or expectations in terms of what we can offer. That said, just from the DR perspective, I have seen almost every case starting out with a complete distrust. And then as trust increases, these threats and reprisals decrease. And that, of course, is just a very simple equation, and that has many elements to it as to how we make it happen. But it is possible to create slowly and with various tools an environment where open discussions can happen. And until that's not possible, we would never force it in the mechanism to talk to someone who requesters don't want to talk to. So I hope these reassurances are there for you, that we do think a lot and we exchange a lot internally as well as to how we can improve our working methodology to facilitate easy access and safe access. And also, as we exit a case, we want to make sure that safe space remains to the largest extent possible, and that people feel that they have achieved not only remedy, for example, in a DR case, but also created a better living around the whole situation which they found us with.
Thanks, Ursula. I see Kate jumping for the opportunity to make one last question intervention. I think that's all the time we'll have, and then we'll need to wrap up.
Oh, it is on? Okay, great. Thank you. Just wanted to say thanks so much to the panel. You can see how much interest there is in this issue, issue from how many people there are in the room. And I really wanted to take advantage of the fact that Charles DeLeva is actually in the room to ask whether he could just give a very, very brief, sorry to put you on the spot, Charles, but just a very brief summary of how we can interact with the panel. You know, what's next? Like, how can we give our views? How can we, tell you what principles matter? How can affected communities give their views and be involved in this process? Thank you.
Is that okay for me to speak?
Please do.
Thanks, Kate. So there's an approach paper that Param mentioned that is currently with the board. It's a 7-page approach paper that was written by David Fairman and I. And I feel confident, having listened to today's discussion, that the points that everyone has raised are captured in that paper. And for example, at first, Anthony Cotton raised the point about transition. And as we listened during the preparation of the approach paper, we understood that to be a very serious question. So the approach paper makes it clear that we expect to look at the possible issues of transition if an integration takes place. I mean, we're not making any judgments now. We have to listen to everyone. And in the approach paper, there's a clear delineation of consultation, both with people in this room that will be able to participate, as well as looking at different regional time zones to be able to do online consultation as well. So I hope the board likes the paper. I hope you'll all be able to see it, and that we'll be able to move forward. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Charles. Got about 1 minute left to try to wrap up. I think I'd just close by trying to summarize what the key things that we heard that came out of this session. We heard and we were pleased to hear that there's a common commitment from the board and from the mechanisms to only doing this if it leads to a stronger and a more effective accountability system, which does a better job, not a worse job, of delivering remedy to affected people. We also heard from Param that there must be no dilution or regression of the policies that govern the two mechanisms currently. And he said on the record that we are going to integrate, if we are going to integrate the ENS management and accountability systems across the institution, then there also ought to be a World Bank group-wide remedial action framework. So I think the upsides of creating a better system are clear, but we also heard about how hard this is going to be to pull it off. And Margot gave some pretty compelling remarks about the risks and the politics and competing interests of the day that are going to make this particularly challenging to do well. And so it's up to us in civil society, and it's up to you, the mechanism leaders, to hold the board accountable, hold the task force accountable to those guiding principles, and make sure that we come away with really a 3.0 that's better than 2.0. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you guys.